we'll get started then. So we've got Tom with us today. How are you doing?
I'm very good, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Some good topics that we're going to cover. It sounds like it's going to be interesting. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, we
Um,
will find them good. I don't know about everyone else.
well, hopefully it helps people. I think what we've been discussing over the phone over the last few weeks, I think there's a lot of good information out there for people. Um, and yeah, we can hopefully share it. People will find it and maybe put it to practice if that works for you.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm all for, as we've just kind of been chatting about, is just trying to keep things simple.
Hmm.
If whenever I don't know, whenever I'm delivering a course or chatting to people, what I'd like people to be able to do is have something to go away and go and practice. Because I think, if you can take something away from a chat, a conversation, a course, I think that's really, really good. And if they can actually go away and go and put it into practice and see the benefits, I'm all for it.
So, how do you achieve that? We'll start with a learner for people that are teaching learners. How do you put that into practice with students, giving them something to go away and practice?
Um, Keep it simple is always the first kind of point. I think what we've just been chatting to off air, if that's what we're going to call it.
Yeah, we'll
Uh,
call it that.
yeah. So what we were chatting to sort of off air there is having that conversation with a learner and find out what skills it is that they're struggling with, because then we can begin to look at what remedy we're going to put in to try and help them, and whether that's me giving advice or whether that's them going away and practicing something. It's a physical kind of thing that they're going to be able to take away and give a go with mum and dad or brother and sister or who else they're driving with.
So, something I try, I don't know whether it's something you do or whether it's something you'd recommend with my students. We'll discuss skills shortly. But if we're working on specific skills, I tend to try and have the lesson in that area, a suitable area that's likely not too far from their house, so that the students can then go to that area working on that particular skill. And if they've got their own car to do that, it changes how I deliver my lessons in a way that I'll give them skills to go and practice with mum, dad, whoever, friends. And I'll kind of give them some areas. Go over to these roads, these roundabouts, practice on this, so that when they come back the next lesson, we can kind of revisit that skill, see if they've got it, and then maybe start adding another layer and trying to use their own car for the practice side of things, and then just using me to add knowledge in
Hmm.
preparation for their next week of practicing with family and friends. Is that something that you try to either teach to your PDIs or something that you'd use with your learners?
Yeah, both. Especially with learners, I get quite a few who are getting a lot of private practice. So what I want them to do is to be able to get these skills that we're practicing, to take them away and go and put them into practice with mum and dad or whoever they're learning to drive with. Because ultimately, although our industry is very much test focused, and whether you agree with this or not, I would say 99.9% of learners are test focused. How many turn up to you and say, Josh, I'd really like to learn how to drive safely? Or do they turn up and say, I really need to pass my test? So,
Yeah, it's
you've got that upward hill battle straight away from the first phone call. So if I can give them simple things to actually take away and it becomes second nature for them, we can then begin to dig that little bit deeper into, emotional states and things like that that are also going to affect them. That, yes, we as trainers have a small impact on, in my opinion, but we're not magicians. We can't change their thought process completely. Well, at least I can't. Maybe there's others out there that can.
that's something I'm struggling with at the minute. You've said we're or we try not to be test focused. I try not to have my lessons test focused, but it's certainly something that I'm noticing now and need to improve is preparing my students for the driving test. I mean, an example is I've got one student currently, they can drive, and I can confidently say they can drive, but they're not in a position to take their driving test because of the pressure that comes with the driving test. So that's something I'm myself trying to work on at the minute and look at what's out there. Do you have any tips, advice for students that are getting ready for the driving test that you find maybe help them prepare the last couple of weeks leading up to it?
Actually, I talk about the driving test with my learners very early on. And I'll explain why I think it's a benefit. We've already covered that most learners want to go and pass the test.
Yep.
I'm also very mindful in our industry, there is a lot of misinformation and myths around the driving test. Now, I get sort of funny looks when I'm about to say, but the Cat B test, the learner test, it's the easiest test the DVSA do. It's not a difficult test to pass. And in fact, I've taken pupils to test over my 10 years of doing this who are not very good drivers, but they're safe. And all you've got to do is drive safely for a minimum of 30 minutes. I mean, that's some pretty low standards to start off with. So the reason I mention the driving test a lot is to help with nerves, because learners often hear things from social media, mum and dad, you can't do this, you've got to have your hands at 10 and 2, and you can't do this or you'll suddenly get a driver fault, although everyone's going to call it a minor, which is my little pet hate, but we won't go into that. So I begin to try and introduce it early so they're aware of what that minimum standard actually looks like. So if they do brush the curb and they go, oh yeah, my mate failed for that, I can actually explain to them the process that the examiner goes through when they make an assessment, and explain to them that it's not fault marked. So it's not like, right, Josh did this, he's got a driver fault. They make an assessment under the circumstances at the time. The common one that often crops up is the reverse parallel park, which we all refer to. However, on a driving test, it's referred to as the reverse park exercise. And this is actually one that the DVSA complain about because, they pull learners over and they say, right, Josh, this is the reverse park exercise. And the pupil suddenly goes, well, I've never done this before. And the examiner says, yeah, you have. It's just reverse parallel park. So there is an element of what learners need to know for the test. And then there is how they're going to drive in real life. But like with the reverse parallel park, when I start explaining to learners that they would expect you to try and complete the exercise within about 2 car lengths, they suddenly go, oh, that's loads of room. I go, yeah, because it's the minimum standard. Now, what I want from you later on is I want you to be able to fit into a space that's really tight, because that's the standard I'm aiming for. However, for a driving test, you get about 2 car lengths and the examiner doesn't get out with a tape measure. They make an assessment.
Yeah, that's something that I find difficult when we are discussing the driving test. A lot of students think that they've got to be perfect drivers, and I find it really difficult to get them away from we've not got to be perfect. It's got to be safe and controlled. If it's safe and controlled, then you'll pass. If at any point it wasn't, you probably won't, because I'm yet to find someone, and this is another one we can do this. All the students are, oh, so-and-so said that this examiner is really bad. And the first question I'll ask is, did they pass or fail the driving test?
Yeah.
But they failed. Well, that's why they're really bad.
Yeah.
Find someone that passed and said they was a bad examiner. And then it becomes a bit of a joke when they're like, well, so-and-so failed the driving test last week. I was like, did they tell you that the examiner was really strict? Like, yeah. Well,
yeah.
What did they do wrong? Let's learn from it.
Yeah.
So that's something that I struggle with is getting learners away from perfection and safe. Because
and I think what you've just said there is, I think it's the same I see with PDIs. and ADIs that come to me for training. We as humans, I don't think we like admitting we've done something wrong. So it's easier to say it was the examiner, or the topic at the moment, and whether we talk about this later or not, it was my nerves. My nerves affected me on the day. It's easy for us to blame something than saying, actually, I wasn't good enough, or I just didn't do it on the day. I know I should have done it, but, I just didn't. So my fault, put my hands up, let's do it again.
That was the minute I got my grade for my first part 3 and the examiner told me that I'd failed. As soon as the debrief had finished, I was like, I get it. I understand exactly why I failed. I'm going to go away. I know what I need to do. And not too long later, passed my second attempt. But I think maybe people don't like criticism after the fact. It's difficult when there's this test. You've got a test, and I know at the minute there's maybe 1 or 2 students that their nerves are stopping them doing the driving test. I've had a few in the past where they've been great drivers. Something's happened on the day. So it's difficult. And then, yeah, like you've said, is it nerves? Is it not? Nerves is something that I'm certainly looking into now. There's obviously people out there that can help us with our students and their nerves. But I don't feel like I'm qualified nor got the experience to try and untie a lot of it at the minute. Which is something I'm focused on, is the nerve side of it, because if it is a factor, at least I can support my students around it.
And I think when we sort of mention about that as well, it's from what you said there, I do truly believe that, I don't know your personal circumstances, but I think you probably had a much better chance on your second go because you changed your mentality and you said, actually, yeah, I agree with this. This is where I need to go with. I do tend to see quite a few people that come to me for extra training and they go, I failed my first one because the examiner said this and I completely disagree. And the one that really sort of frustrates me, and I've heard this a few times, is trainees or instructors say to me, yeah, on the drive back after the examiner had told me I'd failed, my pupil said to me it was the best lesson they'd ever had and that I should have passed. And I think, hang on, so you're trusting the feedback from a learner who's never passed a driving test in their life against an examiner who's had years and years of experience? Just find it quite strange. But with the nerve sort of thing there, the way that I try and look at it is, if I've done everything in my power to help that learner overcome their nerves, then hopefully I'm doing the right job. I'm doing it correctly. But if I've not actually done as much as I can do, and I was chatting to another instructor recently, and he said, oh yeah, a lot of my pupils are suffering with nerves. I said, so what are you doing to try and help that? And basically they weren't doing anything. And I thought, well, yeah, okay, that would be like, my pupils not using the brake and me not bothering to do anything about it. So I think we all have a responsibility to try and help the industry. We all have a responsibility with our learners. One of the things that I've done previously with a few learners that have specifically said to me, I'm really nervous about going for this test. We've parked up at the test centre, away from the test centre, walked in when tests are being conducted. So we stand in the corner so my learner can see what it's like. They can see other people interacting. I've even gone over and said to the examiners that I know, look, can you just come and say hi? So at least my learner begins to feel what it's like at the test centre. They go and look at, the examiners. Actually, they were really nice. They came over and said hi. They're not as miserable and as horrible as everyone makes out. So I think if we're doing more and more of those types of things, our pupils then go into it with a lot less stress. If the pupils are told throughout our lessons that actually the driving test isn't that difficult to do, and the majority of time people say it's difficult because they failed. And I do think all of these things can make a big difference.
With going into the test centre, is that test centre specific? So I've heard mixed bags about, are you allowed in? You're not allowed in. it's something that after you've said that, I'm going to go and pose the question to the test centre. Don't know whether I'll get a chance tomorrow, but certainly over the next few days. Do you know if some test centres don't allow people that are not on test to head in there?
Most, as far, well, all the ones that I've used, so I use one, two, three, sort of four different test centres. And all the ones that I've used for that, we don't go and park in the test centre. We'll go and park by it and then just walk in.
Yeah.
I can't say that I've ever had an issue. I've also used the test centre. I know others do because we have toilets at our local test centre. And as driving instructors, one of the things you're never taught on Part 3 training is where all the free toilets are. So I think it's important to recognise this. I can't say that I've ever had an issue, and the examiners that I've spoken to have never posed that as a problem. I'm not saying that's going to be the same on every test centre.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've not had, like, all the examiners in my test centre are all right. You can have a chat with them. They're fine after the test. There's one or two, but they're not nasty. They're not unapproachable. They've got a job to do. They're going to do their job, and they're going to get on with the next one. But I'm fairly certain any of them, if you approach them with a question and wanting help, will likely give it to you. So that's something I have stopped and taken students around, but I've never really gone in when there's tests going on. It tends to be later on when everything's closed up and it's like, oh look, there's the test centre. Have a look at that.
Yeah.
But that's something that I need to do more of with my students coming up to try and help them. I do as much as I can for the nerves, but it's a challenge.
Mm.
And the one thing that you said back there about Part 3 and learning from those mistakes, I just want to put something in here about that for the Part 3 because I think it's maybe relevant. On my first Part 3, I wanted to show the examiner how much I knew and made it a little bit about me and look, I know all of this, I can do all of this. And I failed because I was overloading the student with too much information, too quick, couldn't react to it. But the second one, I almost disregarded the examiner and cracked on with what the student needed and delivered a lesson for that student. And that for me, amongst a few things, I think that was the biggest difference. It wasn't about me and how much I knew. It was about my student and what we needed to develop at that moment in time for the student. So yeah, I learned a lot from the feedback and then going into my next one, which I thought was interesting. I don't know whether there's anything to add on that.
Actually, I've got a question. So do you do that in every lesson?
Do I do what in every lesson?
Not necessarily treat it like a Part 3, but do you deliver your lesson around the needs of the learner?
Yes, and not every lesson, but I tend to, my lessons evolve all the time because I'm always trying to improve.
Yeah.
But everything is very much about the needs of the learner. And there are times on lessons where I question, how do I think that would play out on a Part 3? And if I'm honest with myself, sometimes I'd be like, maybe not great. And other times it'd be like, yeah, we found their need, we improved. But that took, I think it was from my training to where I'm at now, a couple of years down the line, was that need and skill is what's made a big difference now, is really narrowing down what are skills and then why is that skill needed and how best can we improve it and what areas should I use to achieve that. Maybe you can add on that.
Yeah, I know this was one of the things that we'd spoken about before, and it's something that I'm quite passionate about, which is teaching skills over subjects. And it was, I think the word I used earlier was revolutionary to me. When I come from sort of a sports coaching background, although I kind of threw all of that out the window when I did my training. Well, I didn't. I was told to throw it out the window. So I qualified under the old system, the preset test system, which is the examiner role-playing a pupil for 30 minutes and then another pupil for another 30 minutes. And that was kind of what you've just said there. It was, I just had to show the examiner, or we had to show the examiner, we knew all the information. And it was this big information dump. And then I was told that that's how I taught lessons. So I did big long briefings. I did, right, today's lesson, Josh, is going to be on roundabouts. And it didn't take into consideration the skills that are needed. And this is going to make it sound really lazy, but it meant that I had to work my backside off. Where now I want to keep it nice and simple, because if it's easy for me, it'll be easy for my learner. And so everything that I do with learners, everything that I do with my trainees is all about the skills that are required. So the easiest way that I could explain it is if we think of a learner, and although I don't teach my learners acronyms because I don't feel like it's a benefit to them, because, you know, if I said to them, right, Josh, what does MSPSL stand for? Well, they spend all that time trying to think about it instead of doing it. Okay, but if we take MSPSL and how far you want to go with it, if you want to add the gears in or not, whatever. If my pupil can do mirrors, signal, position, speed, and look, well, then they should be able to do anything, shouldn't they? So pulling up on the left side of the road, what sequence do they run through? Well, they check their mirrors, they see what's happening around them, they make an assessment of whether an indicator is needed. You know, they position over to the left, they slow down, and they look to make sure they don't hit the curb. Well, if I'm using client-centered learning and I'm going off the skills they've already got, well, what skill do they need joining a motorway? Mirrors, signal, position, speed, gear, look. So in a simple format, if I just teach those things, it's really simple. It's repetitive, and all I use are different subjects to teach those skills. That's really easy for me as an educator, and that's really easy for the learner because they're doing 5 things instead of left, right, emerging, mini roundabouts, roundabouts, dual carriageways, gyratory systems. You know, you could just go on and on, can't you?
That's where I've had a big difference with the lessons, is those skills and using maybe subjects, topics. I don't know what the word would be, but let's say roundabouts, for example. I mean, I think I teach, from what I've spoke to, I teach driving a little bit different to everyone else, because people don't bring roundabouts in till later on in training, whereas I find them easier earlier on while we're working on speed control. Because if we're doing a left or a right junction, there's a lot of skills that are needed, in my opinion, to achieve that. You've got to slow the car down, you've got to stop it at the right point, you've got to change gear, you've got to look both ways, you've got to find the bike point, you've got to go. Whereas if you're doing roundabouts, we get on a nice long road with a roundabout at the end. It's like, right, I'm going to take control of most things here. All you need to do, slow the car down, maybe do a gear change, or I'll do the gear change. We'll discuss that on the move, and steer the car around to the left. Happy with that? Cool. So all they've got to think about is speed, speeding up, slowing down. And a lot of students, without me telling them, will look right and check that it's clear to go.
Yeah.
I thought, oh, so you know where to look? They're like, yeah, I'm like, okay. Next time, do you want to look, see if it's clear? Yeah, okay. And then they'll go around and they'll look, and it's clear. And then that's a skill. It's setting off, slowing down, changing gear.
Yeah.
And then junctions come a little bit later. If they're struggling with something else, I use junctions as a area where we'll practice a specific skill, maybe emerging clutch control while we're going around a bend. Cool, let's go somewhere quiet. Let's go and do some blind bends. I don't tend to refer to them as blind bends. I ask, can you see? No, what do we need to do? Slow down. And I find that helps, but I wait to be corrected on whether it is or it isn't. But I think it's the responsibility that is shared that I think helps with me and the students.
And that if you're concentrating on those skills, it's the skills the pupil is going to use, and we often refer to them as the building blocks. If you've got that foundation, all I'm now doing, or all I'm helping my learner to do, or my trainee to do, is fill in the gaps of knowledge that they haven't got. So we've already got that foundation. So instead of me doing what I used to do, was give like a 30-minute briefing on all this information dump that they've got to have, I go, well, actually, you seem to know where you're looking. Why are you looking this way? Or because I'm doing X, Y, and Z. Okay, great. So this is what you know. This is what you don't know. Well, all we've got to do is fill in the bit in between. Again, as an educator, that's nice and easy for me.
That, yeah, it is now a lot of the time the students almost teach themselves, and with questioning they can teach themselves. So they might not know the information for whatever it is we're doing, but if they've practiced the skills elsewhere, like, well, what skills are we going to use for this? I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. Cool, do you want to give it a go? Yeah, okay, let's go do that. And away they go. So we've got skills, but do you teach subjects then? This is something where I sometimes struggle to find the balance, for the more, say, complex roundabouts, junctions, multi-lanes, the types that you need local knowledge to get around it the most efficient way, should we say. How do you get around things like that?
I teach them the same skill I would use if I go to an unfamiliar area. So, yes, we all know local knowledge is great. However, what skills have I got as a driver? What skills do I use? Well, generally, if I go to an area I'm unfamiliar with, I go a little bit slower, because then it gives me time to look at the road signs and the road markings and to see what other people are doing. Then I can make an assessment on whether I think that's safe enough to do or not. So those are the skills that I want. Something, I don't know whether you hear this, but I still hear a lot of instructors and learners talking about, oh, I haven't done any test routes. And, I think, well, yeah, but we aren't going to be able to teach you to drive every road. But what I can do is give you the skills to take away to go and drive on every road. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, and I'm not going to say you're not going to make mistakes, because even I make mistakes. However, if we practice those skills, and if we go through some of the basic stuff like the highway code and driving essential skills, DES, all the information's in there, whether it's local knowledge or not.
Yeah, that's the question I get asked quite a lot, is what are the test routes? And I'll be honest, I've not yet sat in a driving test. I probably should for my own experience, but I haven't. The students I've taken to test, I've asked them, do you want me in on the back? And they're like, would you want to come? I'm like, it's your test. You go and do your thing. I'll wait in the test centre. If you want me there, I'll be there. I've got a couple coming up that I think I might end up in the back for comfort, maybe a bit of reassurance. I can whisper in their ear when they need to do something correct. So when I do get asked, what are the test routes? I'm like, I don't know. Don't know what the test routes are. Oh, right. I make a point, and if a student comes back, pass or fail, I'll very rarely ask them what route they took. If they failed, then we'll maybe go back to the area and talk about why it happened and what the dangers were. So I know some of the hotspots of the area, but I don't know test routes. And I hope to keep it that way so that I don't start, oh, we'll just spend half an hour going around this route or that route. A lot of my lessons are around the test centre because it's 10 minutes from my house. But I'll never do a specific test route, and hopefully I'll never know them. Who knows?
Well, yeah. And, with test routes, the thing that we've got to recognise is that it's in the name. So the route is set to test you on varying road and traffic conditions. A training route is designed to help you achieve the need or the goal for the lesson. It isn't designed to throw in lots of different things, because most people don't learn like that. If you're going to learn to juggle, you start off with 1, 2, 3, 4 balls. You don't start off with 100. Although I can't juggle, so perhaps that's wrong. I don't know.
I can't juggle either. So
yeah,
we'll stick with it. We'll make it true.
Yeah, perhaps you can get a juggling ADI on, and they can give a bit more information.
There we go. We'll get them on.
like as we're saying there, you know, I do use the pinch points or the hotspots in my area, but I use that topic or that subject to practice the skills, the basic skills that they need. So we've got one in our area, and I know full license holders who struggle with it. And basically, it's a crossroads on a bend. But if you looked at it, it wouldn't look like that. It goes underneath a bridge. There's a set of traffic lights, but basically, it's kind of like a crossroads on a bend with a bridge and traffic lights. So now I'm making it more complicated. But you know, ultimately, if we come up there, if there's a gap you can take and the light's on green, go. I don't see why we need to make it any more complicated than that. If you think that vehicle from the right is going to crash into you, well, don't go. Wait for them to go and then follow them in. But if I go out and say, right, this is on the test route, this is what you've got to do, they probably will go and pass the test, and they will probably be really good at driving around our area. However, most accidents for young people are happening out on country roads, rural roads, things like that. They're not really happening in these you know, busier town areas because the speeds are lower.
That's something I've started doing now, is country roads. Again, I don't know whether it's right or wrong. I'll use country roads, mirror checks, change of speed. So I'm like, okay, where can we do that? And we've done a lot on kind of built up areas where I'm like, we use country roads. The windy, bendy, you've got to slow down, you've got to speed up, you've got to be aware of what was going on. So we'll use that. We're going to do some country roads. It's a bit different, but focus on your mirrors, drive into the road, so that it makes it real. It's like, oh, I've got a bend coming up. I'm probably going to need to slow down. Let's check, make sure it's safe. I'm going around the bend. Oh, we're going to be speeding up now. It's quite straight. Let's see if anyone's overtaking. And someone will be overtaking. We've got L plates on the back. So,
Yeah.
and it's like, ah, good job you checked your mirrors there, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's good. So I guess that's another example of using a subject or a topic to work on a skill rather than the other way around, if that makes sense.
And if you think about what we mentioned at the start, what you're getting your learner to do there is they're just starting the MSPSL routine.
Yes.
The same as if you go and do any advanced driving, they tend to use an acronym called IPSA. So information, position, speed, gear, accelerate. Now, the same as MSPSL, I always run through the process, but I don't necessarily use every single one. I consider it, but I might not use it. So what they're doing is they've got to speed up. They've checked their mirrors. They've assessed that there's nobody overtaking. They don't need to change position, but they're just going to accelerate. So you're still practicing those core skills, just in a different subject.
Yeah, it's made the lessons more interesting. But a question, how do you get around then? I have some students that want to do specific types of roads. I want to go and do this big complex roundabout. And my question tends to be, well, what skills are we going to be developing by doing that? What are we going to achieve? And like, well, I'm going to go on there on my driving test. Maybe, maybe not. But what skills do you want to develop by doing it? But we need to be client-centered, but this is maybe another direction we can take it. Do you allow students to direct where they want to go, or do you just allow the questions to direct it back to where you want it or where you feel they need to work? Or do you find a balance?
As much as I can, I try and find a balance. But one of the common things I know it's been brought up in some of your other videos is the difference between client-centered learning and client-led learning. I don't know whether you're familiar with the national standards for driver and rider trainers.
Couldn't quote you on it, but I have since been reading through it again. Yes.
Good. It is just such an important document, and we could probably spend a whole hour talking about that, but I won't. But in there, it does sort of explain that what client-centered learning is and isn't, and it isn't about allowing the pupil to take charge. Now, we have to think about, if we look at the marking sheet and the competencies, it often refers to the goals and the needs. Well, the needs can often or sometimes be more important. You know, I might have a pupil on the first ever lesson and says, Tom, yeah, I'd like to go on the motorway today. Well, you know, really, Josh, do you think we should be doing that? And like you said there, if somebody said to me, I want to go and do this roundabout, the first question I'd ask is why? Why do you want to go and do that? Because I need to know more information. You know, if they say, oh, well, I'm going to be doing it on my driving test, well, then this has now started a conversation. And this conversation is normally where my lesson planning comes from. So it might be that they say, yeah, I want to go and do this big roundabout here. Okay, so why do you want to go and do that? Well, it's going to be on my test. Okay, what about this roundabout here? What about that roundabout there? So I can start to introduce other stuff and start this conversation. And then we can go along the lines of, well, which of the skills, like you mentioned, which of the skills do you think you need to practice? Shall we go and do those on some easier ones? And you can demonstrate to me that you can do it on your own. And then we can go and progress on. So what I'm also doing there is putting the ball in their court. If you want to go and do this, well, then demonstrate to me that you're not going to try and kill me, and I'll let you go and do it.
Yeah, I had the students not with me anymore, probably with another instructor telling really bad stories about me.
Yeah.
But they was struggling on minor roundabouts, the skills, and looking for danger, just wasn't looking. And if we did get across a roundabout, you kind of know when someone's not checked.
Yeah.
They just wasn't checking. And every time there was someone coming, they'd be slamming the brakes on. And I'd be like, did you not see them? No, they came too quick. And I was trying to figure out skills. So we never really got away from quiet housing estates, either roundabouts or junctions, whatever the skills were, whether it was emerging or looking at roundabouts or slowing down for roundabouts. And they was getting quite frustrated because they've had X amount of lessons and they should be on the busier roads.
Mm-hmm.
And there was always an excuse for why something was going wrong, wasn't happening. And we had to have a conversation towards the end over responsibility for learning. And it was, I can give you the tools, I can help you in any way you want. But if when mistakes happen, we can't figure out why, we're not going to learn.
No.
And that was a challenge until they decided they was going to go and learn elsewhere. And that was a struggle because I couldn't go on the bigger, busier, faster roads because it wasn't safe. But they wouldn't take responsibility for what was going wrong on the lesson. And there was part of it where I felt I was failing. But I think sometimes there's maybe not the the rapport, the bond with a student where they're not used to making mistakes and they can't deal with it. Have you had many students like that? Have you found a way to deal with people that won't take responsibility for what's happening?
Yeah, and it's not an easy, it's not always an easy thing because everybody is different. One of the things I was told many, many years ago when I first started this is that learning to drive is a participation sport. So, you've got to have participation from both sides, and that's from the instructor and the learner. Now, it's the way I see my role is more as a facilitator. So I'm going to facilitate that learning because I can't force learning on people, but I also can't force people to take responsibility. This was quite a few years ago, actually. I took on this learner, this young lady, and we did the first lesson. And at the end of it, as I used to do then, I'd pull out the diary and say, do you want to book another lesson? And she said, yeah. She said, but I don't know when I'm going to be available. I said, okay, so find out, let me know, and then I'll book you in. And I didn't hear anything for over a week. And then I had a phone call on this Saturday evening from the mother saying, "You didn't turn up for your lesson today." I said, "No, I didn't, because we didn't have one booked." And the mother basically said to me, "Well, you shouldn't rely on my daughter to organise lessons. She's not that responsible." And I said, "Okay, but isn't she responsible enough to be driving a car? If she's not responsible enough to give me a call or drop me a message and say, 'Can we have a lesson today?' then I don't feel she's going to be responsible enough to do that." Now, in all fairness, I don't know whether it's just that she wasn't responsible enough, or whether perhaps mum and dad maybe wrapped her in cotton wool a little bit much and maybe looked after her too much, so she's never had to do that. I don't know. But people have got to want to learn. And I think that comes down to our industry again for driving instructors. People don't know what they don't know. I don't promote myself to be, the oracle of everything, but I'm always willing to learn. And I don't see myself as, at the top of the ladder, but I see myself on the learning path. So I'm open to learning. And if I make a mistake, I'm happy to put my hands up and say, "This was wrong. This was the information I had and it was wrong. I don't mind. I'm learning from it." But I don't think many people like to do that. And that links us to what we were saying earlier. That's why it's easier to blame other people.
Taking a bit of responsibility. I've learned from it. Speaking of parents sending messages, I had a student, this is a little while back now. I had to cancel the night before a lesson. I had an appointment with the children the day after usual. I'd got my dates mixed up, got it wrong. So I messaged to cancel the lesson the following day. And I got a long message back from the parent, how I've been unreliable. They wish they'd known when they booked with me. And I went back through my diary, and it just so happens that this student's lessons had been on a number of days where I cancelled, I'd either had issues or been away. So I went back through my diary. I was like, "Oh, wait a minute. I am quite unreliable on that day over the last 6-8 weeks." And that was something where when I got the message, I was a little bit like ready to type something.
Yeah, how dare you?
I had a look and I'm like, it is me. Because I wouldn't like a student being as infrequent as what I'd done. And I just had to take that on the chin. And it's like, right, I need to be more aware going forward that I need to be managing my diary and making sure I'm not letting people down. So we can learn from all of it going forward, and don't reply straight away. Make sure you check back before you do. Send a message the next day.
Yeah. And I think we could all learn things in life from that. If we're wrong, put your hands up and say, "Look, I'm wrong. My mistake. Yeah, completely my fault. I am unreliable on this day. I do apologize. Completely my fault." And I think a lot of the time people would probably be shocked at the fact that you're actually doing that.
Yeah, I got okay, no problem. See you next week. So it's like, oh, we're all right. We've still got the student. We're good. But yeah, I just explained I hadn't realized that what had happened when I looked back through my diary. Yeah, my mistake. What happened again? Probably, but we'll see.
Yeah.
But yeah, we learn from it. And I think that's all we can do in this job. We've got to be learning. There's so many different people, lots of things change. And I enjoy the learning, and there's so many people willing to give information out there as well, which is good to see. So,
and I think as there are plenty of people out there who are willing to give that information, one of the skills that I try and get all of my trainees to do, and I try this as much with learners as well, is I'm always happy to give my opinion, but I'll always be specific of when it's an opinion. So like with my trainees, if they say to me, "Oh, I've seen you've got to do the 6-point check," and I say, "Well, the 6-point check's a load of rubbish," and I'll prove it to you, because here's driving the essential skills. What does it say? Oh, it says check your mirrors and then do your right blind spot before you move off. And if you chat to any examiner, they'll say the same. They hate the 6-point check. So the skill that I try and give my trainees is, whenever I give you some information, unless it's my opinion, I want you to quiz me. I want you to go out and go and look for it for yourself. I'm happy to point the page or where does it say that in the national standards? Because what they should be able to do is all the information I know, Josh, I've got from other places. I've either found it or I've been on courses. Where have they got it from? Well, the information's out there. And in this day and age, there is some fantastic information on the internet. However, there is a huge amount of misinformation. And if people can differentiate between those two things, I think our industry would improve. My opinion, by the way.
I really enjoy students that quiz me on what we're doing and why. And we'll take that 6-point check, for example. I don't teach it as a 6-point check, mainly because my opinion on that is if they're counting the points, they're not doing a check. They're they move their head at 6 different points and away they go. And have they checked? Do they know what they're checking for? Are they just regurgitating a 6-point check that they need to do? A little bit like MSPSL. I do start to reference it towards the end of training, but that's normally when they're already doing it. They just don't know it as MSPSL. It's we're going to do something, so we're going to check. But yeah, the questions I enjoy from the students, and I'm quite open and honest with them as well. They're like, oh, what would happen if this happened on my driving test? Would I fail my driving test for this? Or why am I doing that? They're the ones that are like, why do we need to do that?
Yeah.
I'm like, cool, let's pull over. And half the time I try and get the answer out of them, just working through questions. It's like, so does that make sense now? And if they say, yeah, we're good. If they say no, I'm like, right, let's try and find another approach to it. But they're the lessons that I find a little bit easier. And a lot of students seem surprised when they ask why, and I'll take the time to delve into it, because I think a lot of them have just been told, this is what you need to do. This is why. And we could do this all night, but I think that comes back to schooling and education. You can't be wrong. Don't question the system. Just this is the formula. This gives you your answer. That's what you do. Whereas I much prefer my lessons to be a to and fro. It's like you said, find out what they know. Most of them know a little bit more than I expected when I started this job.
I completely agree.
I'll get students in the car and the first lesson tends to be, this is how you adjust the seat. This is how you adjust the steering wheel. Make sure you can reach the clutch and put the clutch all the way down to the floor. And I won't at this point have told them which one the clutch is. I'll just watch. And if they put the clutch to the floor, I'm like, cool, one job done.
Yeah.
Can you reach the accelerator? Yeah, okay. Can you reach the brake? Cool. So you know which pedal's which. How do you know that? Oh, I've been watching people. Okay, so you're proactive around the learning. And it makes it, I find, a lot easier than, okay, this is a clutch. And they're sat there like, yeah, I know that. This is what you use it for. Yeah, I know that as well. But when you get the questions, I enjoy it. And we end up down, oh, let's find the publication. Let's find the book that it says it in. If I can't give them an answer, I'll hold my hands up and go, I'm not sure on that. Let's find out. Or your homework before the next lesson is to give me the answer.
Yeah. And I've kind of found that many people don't know how an index works for a book. So, and I say to some of my learners, have a look at the index, find out, where this information is. And they're like, what do you mean the index? I'm like, oh, great. Okay. So look at the back. The word that you want, what does it begin with? What letter? Now look, oh, okay, so I can find this information. Those are still the skills that we're talking about. I want my pupil to have the skill to be able to go and find information. So if the highway code changes in 10 years, they've got a little bit of information to think, oh, okay, let me go and have a look, see where it is. Will they do that? Maybe not, probably not. But I can sleep better at night knowing that at least I've attempted to try and do, the right thing.
Yeah, it's taking ownership and responsibility as well, which is good. And when you get people that are proactive around it, asking the questions and looking for the information, I find they tend to pick things up if they're willing to go and do their own research between lessons, watch videos. Again, some of it good, some of it not so good on YouTube, but getting out there and getting the information for themselves. I did at one stage have well, I've still got it, another YouTube channel for some of the areas in Swindon.
Yeah.
Some of them watch the stuff that's on there, some of them don't. But it's that taking responsibility for their learning and trying to facilitate it for them. And I've learned now I can only do what I can do. If people go away and don't think about driving for the next week, then they're probably going to be with me a little bit longer. But I can't set them. Well, I probably could set them homework, but they're not going to do it. So I've taken to even to. Do you do lesson plans and reflective logs? How do you manage your students' lessons?
So with my learners, I'm a little bit old school. So I don't make notes for my learners because I'm pretty good at remembering what we've done. Bearing in mind, I only have a handful of learners anyway. So as you know, most of my training is ADI, PDI, and train the trainer. But I still keep a handful of learners because A, I still enjoy it, which sounds a bit strange to say. And B, as we were mentioning earlier, I think it's really important to keep my skills up. If I'm teaching somebody else to be an instructor, I want to have a learner there to make sure that I'm keeping those skills up. So I use with my learners a reflective log, which is based on the DVSA version. However, I've tweaked it. So on the first lesson, I give them this sheet of paper, and this is up to them to bring to each of the lessons. And it's a really simple reflective log. We have all the skills and subjects, and 1 is introduced, 5 is independent. And at the end of the session, I get my learners to fill it out. And the important thing is I don't fill it out, because reflective logs should be them reflecting on themselves with my help, as opposed to me saying, right, Fred, you've done 3 today, or you've done a 4. That's not effective evaluation. However, it needs to be honest. So if Fred says, yeah, I was 5 on everything and I've had to help a lot, I'm going to explain to Fred, actually, what about this roundabout? More often than not as well, it actually goes the opposite way. So my learner might say, oh yeah, I think I was a 2 today. And I say, well, hang on, Fred, actually a 2 is fully instructed. Did I really give you that much instruction? So I can use this as a confidence building thing. So that's how I get them to reflect. With my trainees, I have a very similar process. So part of being audit registered is we are supposed to get them to do a certain amount of paperwork. I have reflective logs that I get them to fill in after every lesson. And that helps us to identify their goals. But also, I do a training log of what we've gone through and where I feel they need to work on. Because as you're probably well aware, we don't know what we don't know. The reason they're paying me money is so I can say to them, these are your areas of development, this is what you need to do. They might think they're the world's best driving instructor. And I'm thinking, well, I'd have only scored you a 24 on a part 3 of a standards check. So there's areas you need to work on. So I get them to do a reflective log, and I give them a report from every lesson that I observe or I deliver with them. And I mark it against the criteria from the 17 competencies, because I do truly believe that those competencies make up a good lesson. They don't include everything, but I do believe they make up a good lesson.
Yeah, it's I guess the more familiar you are with the competencies and move away from it being a box ticking exercise and more of a needs based, like if you're safe, if you understand the needs of your student and provide a lesson working on those skills, then I've only done a part 3. I'm waiting on a standards check, but I found that if you do that you'll do all right on a standards check. I mean, my first one wasn't a terrible score, but it was a fail. So it's, yeah, I think it's when, if you understand it and understand that learning needs to take place, it kind of makes sense. There's, how else could you manage the quality of instructor or trainer that's out there if there wasn't some form of test that can be marked on your ability? That there has to be something. There's got to be some accountability for you being out teaching people in a vehicle that's capable of doing 70 miles an hour on a motorway.
Yeah.
So with your students, do you deliver lessons? Can they observe you teaching your pupils? How do you manage that? This is something that has come up a lot with the people I've been speaking to. Is there's people getting up to a part 3 that have never seen a driving lesson. Is that something that you incorporate into the training?
Yeah.
How do you manage that?
Normally, that's my first point of contact, actually. So if somebody contacts me and says, I'm thinking about becoming a driving instructor, we have that conversation on the phone. I normally try and explain the whole process, and we chatted about this earlier. I give them all the information that's out there. I also point them in the direction of where they can find that, so it's not just me telling them. But normally my first point of contact is, why don't you come and sit in on driving lesson to see what it's all about? And then you get firsthand to see what it's like. I can explain some bits as we go through, and I can give you my advice on the good things and the bad things about the industry and what this job entails. But come and have a look. However, I do kind of explain to them that what you're seeing me do isn't necessarily what you're going to do, because I've built all these skills up over 10 years of getting it wrong. So it might look as if it's really easy, but what's going on up here is probably a lot more than you can actually physically see. So that's the first thing I tend to do with people, and quite a lot of people do that. They say, "Oh yeah, great. Can I come and do that?" In fact, somebody contacted me not so long ago, a month or so ago. She left the industry in 2016, and has been umming and ahhing of whether to come back into it. And she contacted me, said, I found you on the audit register. What do you suggest? I don't know. I'm sort of on the fence. I said, come and sit in on a lesson. And after the lesson, she went, I want to get back into it. How do we start training? She said, because that's what I want to do. So for her, it was a great thing. And I know we mentioned earlier, I find it really strange that there are people in the industry who qualify or go into their trainee license or go for a part 3 and they've never seen a driving lesson. Did you get to see any when you were doing your training?
Yes, but it wasn't part of training.
Right. Okay.
I think it was. I think, fortunately, the trainer who took me from a part 2 was like, "Do you want to come and watch a lesson? I've got a student later on." I was like, "Yeah, cool, let's do that." So I went out, watched that. And then there was one, I think it was an hour lesson on my 40 hours intensive.
Right.
That minimum required to build a new
Yeah.
career.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I'd done a 40-hour intensive course, and 1 hour of it was watching a lesson. A lot of it was fault finding. But when I came back and got a dual control, I think I can't remember whether I had the dual control car, I can't remember the timing. But I came back, started delivering lessons for free. And it wasn't until just before my part 3, Rick, who I'd done episode 1 with, we started observing each other's lessons. And I don't think he'd seen a lesson, and I'd seen maybe 1 or 2 lessons. And then between us, we figured it out together through what we could find online. And that really made a difference to both of our training, was watching each other's lessons. But at that point, we was both a couple of weeks away from part 3s. So it's like, we've not really got time to start reaching. We probably could have, but we was like, we're just sitting in each other's lessons, go grab a coffee somewhere, talk about it. And I think we was quite fortunate that we was both willing to pick each other up on weaknesses
Yeah,
rather than, "Oh, yeah, that was a good lesson." So, but not really. This happened. This happened. Um, so we was, I think we're both experienced enough through previous jobs and experience to pick each other up, explain why, but also willing to ask questions about, well, what would you do here? What would
yeah,
you do there? That was a huge difference from my knowledge in my lessons, teaching for free. And then once we started observing each other's lessons and picking each other up, I noticed a huge difference in that. And I think it's something that should be done more with people coming into the industry. I've had, since I've started, I've had 3 people observe lessons with me that are thinking about being a driving instructor. And I'm like, oh, come and watch one of my lessons if you want. Um, None of them have taken it up. So I assume that I've been putting them off. But one of them was my friend's about, yeah, it must have been a few months ago now. And he sat in for a 90-minute lesson. He's like, I don't know how you do it. Like, what do you mean? He's like, I couldn't sit in the back for 90 minutes. I ain't going to be able to do it all day. I'm like, it's a good job that you've came and watched it before you signed up and
yeah,
got yourself, what, 2.5 grand into a contract and then decided you don't like it.
yeah,
So it's crazy. So there's some advice from my point of view is observe a lesson
yeah.
as early as you can and watch as many as you can.
I agree. And if we look at it from the other perspective, and this is what I say to my trainees, is the more times you get other people sat in the back of your lessons, the easier it is when the examiner gets in the back because you're used to other people watching your lessons. I would have no issues with the DVSA calling me up and said, Tom, we want you to come for a standards check or an audit assessment tomorrow. Okay, fine. Because I have people in the back of my car nearly every single lesson I deliver. And so for me, I don't mind having people there. It's a fear that has now gone because I'm so used to doing it. And I think that can be a benefit for you guys when you're not only training, but also when you're looking at CPD. So if I get trainees come to me and I'm delivering their training on a trainee license, I have some other trainers, a colleague and friend of mine, Lee, he lives not very far away. I'll always make sure that he sits in on some of their lessons to give them feedback when they're on the trainee license, because I want other trainers in the back of their car. I want them to be used to people watching their lessons. I just find it so funny that as an industry, we are so against sort of people giving us feedback. Yeah, that's pretty much what we do all day is tell other people what they've done wrong. Yeah, as soon as we get told it, we hate it.
It's I I don't understand it. I appreciate feedback and I like to think I'm receptive to it because there's always something to learn, no matter what. And I'm finding this now. I was talking to a PDI the other day who I think might be coming on, and I was just talking. I'm like, oh, I've got a few people that get a bit nervous around the test, just having a chat, and they was like, oh, I sometimes let them mock test me. And I'm like, what? They was like, yeah, just to switch it up a little bit so they can see what's going on. I'm going to try that. And I had a student last week who was really struggling with the lesson. Right? Do you want to swap for 10 minutes? You can watch all the mistakes I'm about to make. And they're like, what? But yeah, just something different. There's no pressure. You're clearly getting a bit overwhelmed. Let's just swap for 10 minutes. And I was like, yeah, okay. So they're writing everything down now. My positioning was really bad. This was really bad. That was really bad. But then when they got back in the car, it was just a lot calmer. And that was something that I've done demo drives in the past, but not like, oh, you just assess me and see what you can see from that point of view. And, and that made a big difference to that lesson. It was, yeah, they came back in the driver's seat a lot more relaxed and ready to go again. I'm like, that seems to work.
And these, I'm going to keep referring to it because this was kind of our main thing for today. Those are the skills that you're picking up that you're going to put into your instructor toolbox. And the more tools you have in that toolbox, the better instructor you're going to be. Because when you come up against a pupil who's struggling, you're going to try something. If it doesn't work, you're going to throw it away and try something else. It's the people that only have a couple of tools in that toolbox that I think struggle in the industry. And, my toolbox isn't full, Josh, but, I've got lots in there that I can bring out and try. Sometimes I get to the end of those tools. Other times it's the first one that works. But those are all the kind of skills that I think we as an industry should be thinking about and trying to put into practice. I've often come up with these skills just on the fly on a lesson, pulling my hair out thinking, oh my God, what am I going to do? I know, I'll just try this. And it worked. And I think, oh man, I wish I'd thought about that, 5 hours ago.
Yeah, that was an example of really recent that I'd not really thought of. And my opinion was always they're learning to drive. It's a practical skill. They need to be in the driver's seat. But actually, at the end of that lesson, I asked the student, how did you find that? And their feedback was really good. I got back in the car and I drove home. If we didn't do that, the lesson would have ended when I got overwhelmed. And I was like, so we achieved a lot just from, right, let's try something different. And that's from a conversation 2 weeks ago. I've not given them credit for it yet. There we go. I've been using your toolbox.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's always something, and that's what I find with some students is I think you've got to be willing to try and explore different things. And I take it quite personally. If they're not getting something, it's my fault. We need to head back to, maybe a few steps earlier and build back up again because maybe something was missed. But I always find it, apart from if there's a student that's just not taking responsibility for, I looked, you didn't.
Yeah.
But in general, when people are struggling, I'm like, right, I need to do something different. I've got to go and figure out how to untie this to help you progress.
And I do truly think that's a great mentality to have. And that's very similar to how sort of my philosophy on our industry is. If something's not working, it's my fault. If I get to the point where I can honestly say I have done everything in my power, well, then I know I can sleep well that night because I have done everything. But if I'm honest with myself and I think, well, actually, I probably could have done this better, well, I'm still on the learning path. And that is what I think helps me to get better, is to keep that evaluation and that self-evaluation and think to myself, what could I have done better here? Because that's what I want my learners to do. That's a skill I want my learner, is if they come up to a roundabout and they've, nearly crashed, I don't want them to go, oh, it was that, that white van man. I want them to think, right, what could I have done differently to avoid that situation? Because that's what a good driver would do.
Yeah, I find that's when mistakes do happen, we need to balance it with the good things and the mistake. I think there can be too much focus on the mistake at times for students as well. It's like, you've done this wrong. There's a mistake. There's a mistake. It's like, and they're going to be sat there in their lesson like, what am I doing right? What am I doing? Why we're here if all you're going to do is tell me my mistakes? But so you work with PDIs, and I guess you get a few that have partway through the process and are looking for additional help. Do you see any common things that people are struggling with that you've got pointers that might help people in a similar position? So someone that's maybe on a pink, got a part 3 coming up, because you seem to see the same questions on social media or very similar questions. I'm just wondering if there's anything you found that are common, either mistakes or misconceptions around the process that would help people.
That is a really, really good question. And unfortunately, I'm going to sound rather negative now. I think there's so much that it would be difficult to try and pinpoint some of those things. It does link it back to, for me, two of the highlights. One, just keep it simple, because teaching people to drive shouldn't be that difficult. And I think we overcomplicate things as an industry. And then look at what the skills are. Now, I'm going to take a little step back in order to move forward. One of the questions you asked me earlier was how do I sort of incorporate my learners and trainees? Well, like today, I've had a qualified ADI. He's only been qualified for about a year, but he contacted me and said, I'd like some additional training. I think I've got a standards check coming up. I'd like to make sure I'm doing the right thing. What do you suggest? I said, well, I'd like to put you out of your comfort zone. So what I want you to do is come to me and deliver a lesson to one of my learners. And he's like, oh, okay, that'll be interesting. So the way that I structure that is, and my learners love it, because they get free lessons. So I don't charge the learner, I charge the trainee, because the lesson is about the trainee, not the learner. So we use the learner instead of doing role play, but it's far more real life. And the learner that I use today, she is just the world's best learner, because she's really honest, and she'll sort of say, actually, I didn't like you telling me that. It overcomplicated things. So then that honesty transfers across and we can have a chat with the trainee. So I try and deliver my training the opposite to how I had it done. And I try and focus on what that trainee needs. Now, what I don't often see is the demonstration that you were talking about earlier. So when I deliver a lesson to a trainee, it's the same process I would do with a learner. So I'm giving a demonstration of how to set up a lesson, how to plan a lesson, how to have a conversation, how to identify what skills. So I can get a new trainee in the car and we can chat about things. What are you hoping to get out of today? What's going to make it a good lesson? And then when we've got an idea of what we're working on, I can go, right, Josh, push pause. What have I just done? How have we got to this point now? And then the trainee goes, wow, actually, we did a mind map, or we did this, and you asked me these questions. And I say, so how have we got to this point? Oh, yeah, I see what you mean, Tom. This is what I could do with my learners. So I don't feel that enough is done in our industry to allow the trainees to get a good idea of what is involved in our industry. And so if I was to pick one thing, I don't think they're given enough information, enough of the correct information. Do you feel when you started to go into this training, do you feel like you were given all the information that was available, or just what perhaps the trainers wanted you to know?
I don't feel I was given enough information, and I probably didn't do enough research.
Yeah.
I've probably mentioned, I don't know whether I have on record, but I came from a teaching background. So I'd spent 8 years teaching a number of different topics within the military.
Yeah.
So I think I adapted quite well to this job. I've gone from teaching 30 people in a day, a number of different subjects all day, and they don't want to be there. I don't want to be there, but we've got to get through it together.
Yeah.
To teaching one person, one subject, and then breaking that subject down into smaller chunks. At the time, I don't think I was conscious of subjects and skills, but I picked up quite quickly when it was like, oh, we'll do some roundabouts today. And I'm like, what part of roundabouts are we doing? And then that's where the skill, and then I'm seeing more and talking to more people now, and that's where the skills came from, and breaking it down to make it simple. But as for the training, I don't think so. And I find it odd that the feedback that I'm getting from a lot of people is around the training and the lack of support. I think the smaller schools seem to offer a lot more support to the PDIs than the bigger schools. The bigger schools are like, yeah, talk to your trainer. It'll be X amount. Yeah, but I've already paid thousands of pounds. Whereas
Yeah.
if you go to the smaller schools, I think people are more willing to offer that additional training. Yes, maybe at a cost, but are you in for X amount every week for the next 2 years?
Mm.
So in short, no, I didn't have access to all the information. And I'm finding more and more now just through the podcast.
Yeah, I can
There's a
imagine.
lot more information that I think should be common knowledge. I've started reading through and looking at the GDE, which
Yeah,
I'd been confused over what it was. Goals for driver education.
correct.
Um,
Yeah.
so initially I was at a GDE, guidance for driving examiners. Let's go and see what they're looking for.
Yeah.
But that's where TLAs and FLAs, I can't stand them,
Yeah.
abbreviations, mnemonics. So yeah, that's where I'd like this to go as well, is getting more awareness over what information is out there for people and knowledge. And I think people need to be speaking to more trainers,
Mm.
is what I wish I'd have done. Maybe I decided in the end to just work with one trainer, but it's a bit backwards that you just get given a trainer with a lot of schools. So this
Mm.
is your trainer. I don't really get on with them. We've not got anyone else in your area. Good luck.
Yeah.
So how do you share that knowledge with your students? Do you send them to relevant publications? Do you get them to research it themselves? Do you give them the tools, or do you give them the information? What tends to be your approach?
I tend to do bits of both. And actually, that's some advice that I tend to give. And this probably isn't the best business advice. But if I get a trainee call me up and say, I'm interested in training as a driving instructor, I often say to them, you know, as I've already explained, come and sit in on a lesson. This is all, this is the information. This is what I feel you're going to need. But I do suggest you ring other schools in the area and find out what they're telling you. Because what I want them to be able to do is perhaps come back and say, why have they said this, but you've said this? And then I can say, well, this is what the DVSA say. So, as I've said to you, if it's my opinion, I'll tell you it's my opinion. But if it's fact, I'll show you where that information is. So already I'm beginning to try and get them to think, right, they're cheaper, but they've already given me some misinformation. So now that's going to help me when I make my decision. And, I do think that that's really important. So as much as I do with my learners and with trainees and with instructors, I want to do everything. So I want to give them some information, but I also want them to go and find out, because I want them to have that skill to, when they read something on Facebook, like, you've got to do the 12 o'clock rule on roundabouts, they think, hang on, I'm sure that's not mentioned in the highway code or the driving essential skills. Let me go and have a look. And again, it links us back to them having that ability to be able to do that. And I don't know about you, but I fell into the trap when I did my training. I believed everything my trainers told me. And it wasn't always correct.
Did I fall into a lot of my training was around mistakes.
Right.
So it was
Yours or theirs.
well, role play. It was
Okay.
with a lot of examples where the trainer would be driving and they'd do something, they'd stop too late at a junction, they'd be driving too close to the curb. Why is this happening? Why is that happening? So it was a lot of fault identification from what I remember. I think
Yeah.
the first day might have been a load of information. Here's a load of information, take that. And then after that, it was kind of use the dual controls. Here's some mistakes. Now you've got to try and preempt the mistakes. Rather than, and I think this is something that's missed, in my opinion, learning to teach, learning how to have a conversation with a student, learning how to use questions to what's needed, because a lot of people are like, oh, we shouldn't use closed questions, we shouldn't use loaded questions, we should use open questions. I don't know the difference between all of them, but sometimes I'll use a question where the student quite kind of knows the answer. So it's like, oh, what mirrors are you going to check now? That's maybe not a good question. But when they tell me middle mirror, left mirror, then I'll follow it up with, so what are we looking for? What can you see in there? Rather than what are we going to do now? Because at times I get a long-winded, well, I'm going to do this, do that, do the other. And I'm like, right, we've lost a bit of concentration there on what we wanted to do because we're talking too much. But I think I'd have liked to have seen more training around the communication between you
Yeah.
and the student, because I was fortunate. I came from a background where that was needed every day, and it could be someone who's fresh out of basics to someone that's been in the military for 35 years. And I needed to figure out how to approach it so I could transfer that to my lessons. But I don't remember there being any of that through my training.
Mm.
Is
And
that something that you see?
yeah, yeah. And it links back to our original thing. Communication and conversation, that's a skill we need as driving instructors. So that's one of the core skills that I get my trainees to train in. So, you know, when we get on the first ever session, they don't know what they don't know. They don't know what's going to happen on that session, even if we've had a conversation. So I'd normally start the conversation off with, you know, what skills do you think you're going to need as a driving instructor? And they'll often come up with many of the competencies on the marking sheet. Oh, I need to, you know, good communication. Okay, really good. Well, we can link that to a competency. And they go, oh, I probably need to be aware of what's happening outside of the car. I go, okay, great. We can link that to several competencies. So those are all those types of skills. And as we mentioned earlier, I can demonstrate those skills to show them what it looks like and how we can use it. You mentioned about the use of questions, and I actually, well, not actually agree with you. I do agree with you that we don't necessarily. It's a bit like pedestrian crossings. Do people really need to know all of the names, or do they just need to know how to use them? And that's my analogy for questions. The only bit of advice I give with questions is you need a purpose. What's the purpose of the question? And if the purpose is to get an answer, then it doesn't matter if I say to them, what does this sign mean? Or what mirrors are you going to check? Well, the reason I'm asking that is I've got a purpose for it. Now, I could go further down the line, and the type of question I use will depend on the learner and it will depend on the circumstance. So a question I often will use instead of what mirrors will you check is, let's say we're coming to move out past a parked vehicle. I'll say to my learner, is there anyone overtaking us? So what do? Instinctively, they check their mirrors. So I've given them a purpose. My question has got a purpose and I've given them a reason. Now, equally, I could say, what mirrors are you going to check? And they'll say center and right. What are you looking for? What's there? So like you said, I've backed it up. I've followed it with more questions.
That seems to be something that I'm seeing come up a little. I don't know whether it's a little more or now I'm spamming every group that I can on Facebook. Is a lot around questions. What questions should I be asking?
Yeah.
Do you think that's something you can? How do your PDIs learn that? I've learned it over a few years, not as a driving instructor, but just trying to develop myself and reading a few books. But how do you help your PDIs do that? Because it's a hard skill to get used to.
I do an exercise that I found really beneficial, and it doesn't work for everybody, but I would say 95% of the time it does. So I know you know a little bit of my background. I failed a standards check in 2016. It was the first standards check I ever did. I'd done check tests before that. And I was kind of told by my trainers, it's all about questions. You've got to ask these questions. Anyway, I failed. 3 months later, I took another one. I managed to scrape through. And that was when my life in the industry changed. And I left the company I was with. I retrained myself. So I went on lots of different courses. I read every book that I could find. And I turned up for several lessons while I was retraining because I didn't understand questions and how to use them. And I remember one lesson saying to my learner, look, for the next 30 minutes, I'm not going to charge you for this lesson because I'm going to play a game. And unless it's safety critical, where I need to tell you what to do, I'm only ever going to ask you questions. And I did that several times, and I learned so much about the importance of questions. So I incorporate that now into my training. So when a trainee comes to me and I've got one of my learners there, I might say to them, right, we're going to manage the risk. It's my responsibility, your responsibility, but you cannot tell the learner what to do. What you have to do is ask them questions. And that forces the trainee to think more about what's the purpose of the question? Why am I asking this? What do I want to get from it? And when I've done this with trainees, they've often said after how beneficial they found it. So that's one that I tried, and I did it with myself, with my learners. And I just said, look, this is going to go completely wrong. I'm not going to charge you for the next 30 minutes, but I learned so much from it. And yeah, those are the types of things that I try and include into my training, because I can't give you a list of questions because your learner's going to be different. Your situations are going to be different. What I can give you is the skills to think about what you need to get away from that. What do you want to get out of it? Why are you asking that question? Is it, a recall question because you want to know their theory? Is it because you want to try and dig deeper and find out, what their emotions are? And I'll give you a funny one that I had earlier this year. And without using the right types of questions, I never would have got to the reason behind the fault. So my learner, young lady, we're coming up to this left turn. I said to her, take the next road on the left. And basically, we came in too quick. So it would have been really easy for me to say, look, Freddie, you weren't using your brake or you were coasting or stuff like this. But the actual reason she came in too quick, and with a conversation and with some questions, we got to it. Because she said to me, as I came up to that junction, Tom, there were some cute dogs on the corner and I got distracted. So, for the rest of the lesson, every time we'd go somewhere and there were some dogs, I'd say, forget the dogs, concentrate on what's going on. But she probably wouldn't have told me that if I hadn't have used a conversation, which is two-way, and asked the right types of questions.
Yeah, I had similar recently, a student going over roundabouts too fast. And no matter what we tried to work on, what we tried to do, going too fast. So we stopped, we had a conversation. I asked a question, I can't remember, maybe one or two questions to narrow down what skills we needed to work on. But then I kept kind of asking question, why do we need to work on that? And then it was, okay, so all of that information. Why are we not applying it? What's happening? And I delved a little deeper, and the student their intentions coming up to a roundabout was to get on and off as quick as possible so they didn't hold anyone up.
Yeah.
And I never would have got to that without asking those extra 2 or 3 questions and just being willing to keep that conversation going about, well, why are we not putting these two things together? It, but we're not doing it. Why not? And then, we got to it. And it changed the rest of the lesson because there was no pressure. It was like, just don't worry about holding. They're my worry. You do you, away we go. And it changed the lesson completely. But I don't think I'd have got that information, not that lesson, if it wasn't for delving a little deeper with the questions. So I think sometimes we can be too quick to take the first answer and be, okay, let's go and do that.
And how easy would it have been for you to assume that you knew the answer?
And I didn't.
Said, oh, yeah, you're just going too fast. You need to slow it down, you stupid learner. And it's easy for us to do that. But if we spend that little bit of extra time finding out, then, there's that for me is one of the biggest things. We often talk, and I don't think the word fault is a rude word. In our industry, there are some people that say we shouldn't use the word fault, but the DVSA define it as any area of the learner's driving that needs development. Well, that can be internal as it can be external. Well, the only way I can find the internal stuff is ask them. And the word or the question that you used a moment ago, which is why, for a 3-letter word, I think it is one of the most powerful questions you can ask. And I don't just ask it to my learners. I get my trainees and I ask it for myself. Why am I asking this question? You know, why do I want this? Why do you want this? What's the reason? And I think if we can do that a little bit more, it gets much, much easier.
Yeah, there was. I know you mentioned about books. Maybe we'll do that in a minute. There was one. When did I get it? I think I got it as a start. Maybe it's just as I was starting this. It's called The Coaching Habit Start with Why.
Okay.
And I've recently dug that out again to give it another read, based on a lot of people asking questions about questions. So I want to go through it again and see, now I know what I know, if it's still applicable. And if it is, and I think it's relevant to people, then I've got some sort of reference that will help people, because it's almost a work through book as well. So there's bits for you to take notes. But the coaching habits start with why. Maybe that's what got me on my questions. Who knows?
And I do think they are so important. And yes, I've got this bank of questions in my head, but I always start with a question, and then my next question, I can't line up really until I've got the answer from the learner. You know, if I've just got 5 questions in a row that I'm going to ask, well, it's like going into a maze. Well, I might go and get lost somewhere along the way. So I can get this thought-provoking question first of all, but then I'm going to be able to find a path to where I want to go to. One of the questions I often use with learners is, and the skill that I'm testing is observations. You know, I might say to them, what information have you got up ahead? I mean, that is a massive question, but it allows me to understand quite a lot. If they say, oh, there's a cute little dog on the side of the road, well, I know they're not paying attention to the group of school kids the other side of the road, or the pedestrian crossing where people are waiting. Where at the same time, I could say, what are you going to do about the traffic lights? But it always brings me back to, what's the purpose of my question? Why am I asking that question? What do I want to get from it? And I do think it's important that we question ourselves. I don't want to get too philosophical because it gets boring then, but
I think it's the way you ask the question as well, without, like I say, we can go down to a tangent, but the students need to be comfortable to give you an honest answer as well, and not just give you the answer that they think you want. So I think being approachable is going to help massively with the questions. If you're asking a loaded question at an irrelevant time, the student's going to feel obliged to give you the answer that you want. So yeah, maybe the way you ask them and the type of questions and when and why. But yeah, I don't have a bank of questions. I just have, tell me why, or what are we going to achieve with, or a conversation starting with the question. I tend to do a lot of it parked up. If there's issues that we need to get around, it's like, right, let's go and figure out why it's happening, and then from there we can fix it.
Yeah. And I do think that that's again another important skill for us as instructors, is to be able to recognize that, and as we said, just not assume that we know why something has happened. You mentioned about getting learners in the car for the first ever time. And actually, I begin with a question there. So when they first jump in with a learner, I want to bridge the gap, as I call it. So find out what they know and what they don't know. So one of the first questions I normally ask a learner is, what have you seen other people do when they get in a car? And that learner then will normally go through most of the cockpit drill because they've seen other people do it. One of the ones that I often get is they go, oh, I've seen people wiggle the gear stick. I go, why do they do that? I don't know. So I know that they know that people are doing it, but they don't know why. So now I've only got a little bit of information to fill in. Now, okay, they might not do it in the correct order, but I think we're a bit old school if you say your cockpit drill has to be done in a specific order. As long as they do things safely, does it really matter? Yes, there are some pros and cons, but how far down the rabbit hole are we going to go? So yeah, those questions I think are really important. And what it also does, in my opinion, it sets up what the training is going to be like. They know that I want to know their opinion, and they know that I'm interested in having a conversation. And it's not, I'm the instructor, you're the learner, shut up and listen, which is what I used to deliver lessons like.
I did, but that was in the military when I was allowed to.
Yeah, a little bit different from what I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's been a wide range of stuff that we've been through. Is there anything else that you want to go through? Anything that you want to share? I'm not sure how long we've been on. I can keep going all night, but I'm not sure how long people are going to watch.
I would just like to briefly hit on again the skills, because again, this is a passion of mine, and I do think it's really important. And the one that I'd kind of like to highlight is the only maneuver that I teach in brackets I teach is turning the road, and I do that really early. I do it within the first few hours of somebody's driving experience, because it's a really good way of helping the learner with the 3 core skills that they need for any maneuver. So what skills would you say a learner needs to do any type of reversing maneuver? So I'll throw the question to you.
Oh, here we go. Put me on the spot. Clutch control,
Okay, yeah,
steering,
yeah.
observations.
Okay, great. So I'm going to put the steering and the pedals together under control.
Yep.
Yep. And we've
Yep.
got observations.
Awareness.
Oh, okay, yeah. So I've kind of thrown you off a little bit, because what I include in the observations is safety.
Okay.
So I did safety, observations, and as one, yeah. So we have safety observations, control of the car, and then accuracy. So putting the car where they want it to go.
Interesting.
Yeah. Now, on a driving test, accuracy and control are in the same box. So there's only observations and control for a driving test. So I break it down a little bit more. So if a learner can have the skills to control the car, put it where they want it to go, and look around safely, I don't need to teach any other maneuver, because they've got those core skills.
I do similar, but mine's broken down into kind of what I said there was the pedal controls,
Yeah,
hand controls, and observations is, and I don't teach maneuvers specifically, but I will use them for exactly that. Clutch control. If someone's struggling, I'll use maneuvers for clutch control.
yeah.
If someone's struggling with the steering, I'll use maneuvers for steering. Maybe I'll control the pedals, maybe I'll control the steering wheel. Who knows? It depends what we need to work on. But I'll only really do maneuvers later in training, for them to have the confidence that they can do it. And I've started now recently, this wasn't a recent thing, was just taking them to the car park. But okay, I want the car to go from here to there. Do you reckon you can do it?
Mm,
And they'll have a go. And there's no pressure. It doesn't matter if we miss,
yeah,
because you might correct me, I might be wrong here. I think what's more important with any maneuver is the looking around. Because if you're looking around, you're going to see where you want to go. You're going to
yeah.
see what happens. But if you're not looking, you can do the perfect 3-line technique reverse park. But if you don't look around, you run someone over.
Mm. Yeah,
But if you're looking around,
I completely agree. And, it links us to what we said earlier. I'd explain to a learner that on your driving test, if you need to go backwards and forwards several times, it doesn't matter as long as you do it safely. I once watched a young lady in a car park at our local test centre go in and out of a bay about 6 or 7 times. She still passed. It wasn't, it was a terrible park, but she was nervous, but she did it safely. So the examiner passed her. That's as simple as it really needs to be.
yep, and that's something that I've taken on board massively. I had a student come to me who'd failed a driving test, wanted a few lessons before going doing another one. I got her in the car. I was like, what are we doing today? parallel park. You just done a driving test.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I can't do the parallel park.
Oh.
I had a different car to the previous instructor. I didn't have any reference points in my car. 15, 20 minutes without any real teaching or coaching from me. And they'd managed it.
Mm.
And they said, am I allowed to make a correction? Like, yeah, as long as it's safe, make a correction. I thought you had to do it in one go. Like, good, we've just wasted 20 minits, half an hour of your
There you go.
lesson.
Yeah.
But it's safety and awareness.
Mm.
It's made complicated, and I don't think it needs to be. I think it can be broken down, like you've said there, into very simple skills, and we take those skills and we practice them in different areas. And it's, yeah, any other skills that you think a student needs to know above what you've already mentioned?
A learner or a trainee? So we're talking sort of learners as in coming up
Yeah,
for that.
learners. Yeah,
Yeah.
LPLA. Yeah.
The biggest one is their skill to solve problems. Because that's something, if I can help them with that skill, I'm only going to spend 10, 20, 30, 40 hours with them. They're then going, and that's probably what, 0.1% of their driving career, because they're probably going to drive for the next 40, 50, 60 years. If I can help them solve problems and get that skill, that for me is going to be far more beneficial. And I'll give you an example. I had a learner not long after the pandemic. She took a driving test with me in an area that I don't really cover. It's just where she could get a test. And I didn't sit in on the test, but she went off, she came back and she passed. And the examiner said to her, you did really, really well when we came up against that dustbin lorry. And he explained what happened. They drove down this sort of single track road because it's quite a rural area, and they came face to face with a dustbin lorry. So my learner decided to reverse about 150 yards back down the road into someone's driveway to allow them to come through. And the examiner praised her and said, that was really good because I know the road and the lorry wouldn't have been able to carry on reversing. So you did the best thing. I don't teach that. I don't say, right, today we're going to do 150 yards reversing. But she got the core skills and she knew, well, actually, the most logical thing is I'm going to reverse back. So I'm not saying that I gave her that skill, but she did do really well in that situation. And we come up against things like that in her lessons. And I want her to be able to say to me, I think I'm going to do this. Now, it might be wrong. It might be the correct answer. But the problem solving skills is the same thing I want my learners to do. It's the same thing that I want my trainees to do. Because then when they're on a lesson and it's not going well, they can stop and think, right, what am I going to do?
That's good. That's something I struggle with at times, is when something happens outside of the norm of normal driving, is with the students. And that for me is, in my opinion, I might be wrong, is the difference between a test ready student and not. A lot of the time is a student that can drive but needs help when there's something out of the norm. That tends to be the example that I'll use. I'll be like, look, yes, you can drive, but let's look at this situation here. We needed questions, we needed a few prompts to deal with it. These are the things that you have to be able to deal with on your own, because if I'm not sat next to you, you're going to have to deal with them on your own. And I think my opinion is they're difficult to replicate, and you've just got to try and use every opportunity that comes up from as early as possible, using the questions, I guess. But maybe you can add on that. How do you teach that problem solving?
I think, as you said, there are definitely certain things that I can't recreate. But what I can do is I can make an attempt by hypothetical questions. So, if we were on a dual carriageway and we were overtaking, and I might say to a learner, what would you do now if an ambulance or a police car was coming up behind you? What are your options? If your car now just cut out, Fred, and you lost all power, what are you going to do? Now, I don't want that to happen because I'm still trying to manage the risk, but I can use these hypothetical questions to begin to try and find out. What would you do if all your mates are in the car telling you to go faster, Fred? It's a quiet road, isn't it? You could break the speed limit, couldn't you? So I can get those conversations and I can get those types of things. But don't get me wrong, Josh, I don't think that my pupils are all going to go off and never do anything stupid, because if the world was perfect, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in, would we? So I can make an attempt to get them to do these things, but it's up to them to do it. And it comes back to what we said earlier. They've got to take responsibility and they've got to want to be able to learn.
Yes, definitely. It's interesting, and I think learning to drive, like you said, it can be simple. We can make it as simple as possible, but there's definitely skills to doing it, and even more skills to making it natural, like asking the questions, and like you were saying then about hypothetical situations. It's got to be practiced. You've got to get out there, practice the skill, and keep at it. But it's been really interesting. It's been good fun. Any other points? So you've got your skills, and I think we've covered that. Hopefully everyone now, if not, they're going to reach out to you and be like, right, I need some help.
Yeah,
Figuring out what skills
if I've
my
not
students
bored
need to
them
work
to
on.
death enough by keep talking about skills over subjects, then yeah, if they want to reach out, they're more than welcome to do that. And I'm happy to sit for another hour boring them to death on what skills are more important. To be honest, no, those are the main bits when we chatted that you said to me, what would I like to try and help people with? And for me, I found it so more beneficial, and I found my teaching got easier, and my learners were saying how much easier it was, because I concentrate on those skills. It gives me less things to have to teach, and we can focus things a little bit more on the needs of not only the learner but the trainee. We just do it with skills.
Anything else to add? I don't want to, I don't know, you can go on to about anything else that you want.
No,
But I
because I've
think
been
we
told
might end up
I'm
down
not
some
allowed to
rabbit holes.
rant.
You can run, we can run.
No.
The skills I find has really helped me. It just allows you to break things down. Like we said, roundabouts. What skills do you need to be working on to get across this effectively? So it's the roundabouts, not the goal. The skills that are needed to get over the roundabout safely are the need of the student. At least that's my understanding. And more so now I've been talking to you, that we can just break it down to skills. Do you often take responsibility for different things when you're learning? So mirrors, potentially prompting on position to allow them to focus on speed on approach. Is that something you do with your learners as well?
Yeah. In fact, I'll give you an example that I use quite a lot. I had a pupil last year, and I wouldn't have been able to find this out without the conversation or without my skill of asking the right types of questions. He'd never driven before, but obviously he'd sat in a car. He knew certain about. So we had a bit of a chat. And actually what he was worried about was steering. He thought that was going to be the most difficult thing. So I said to him, so what do you want to do then? On this first circuit or a couple of circuits, do you want me to control the car and do everything? You just have a go at steering. He said, oh, can I do that? I said, yeah, of course you can. I said, if you want to, I could drive the car from this side, this seat. It's fine. So we probably did 5 or 6 little circuits on this left circuit, really quiet housing estate. And we pulled over, and he said, that was far easier than I thought it was going to be. And for him, he didn't realize that he could just practice that one thing. He thought he was going to have to try and do everything. And so what I did was I concentrated on the skill he wanted to practice because he was nervous about it. And that allowed me to do that. he wasn't dictating the lesson, but I'd agreed with him. If he's worried about steering, well, let's get you to fix it. And then straight away he said, right, yeah, I think I can do the pedals. And actually, he started to progress very, very quickly. We had an hour lesson, and by the end of it, he was doing mirrors signal for left turns and doing moving off and stopping on his own. And so he'd never driven a car before. Yes, he was quite a quick learner, but we started off very basic. I had all the responsibility other than steering. And then I had all the responsibility other than steering and pedals. And then, so yeah, you've just got this transfer of knowledge. And I often refer to it as drip feeding the information. Instead of piling it on, we just give little bits at a time. It works for me and it works for most learners. And if they're quick learners, I just add more and more and more quicker.
Yes. And that was the lesson I learned from first part 3 to second part 3. Just drip feed it. Don't throw everything at them at once.
And I do think that's more relevant now with that type of thing and with skills, especially with the part 3 and the standards check in the time period that people have got. Because I think if we're keeping it simple and we're looking at skills, if a fault crops up that we need to concentrate on, well, I don't need to think, right, I've got to go to that roundabout because you missed observations on roundabouts. So I can think, well, where else do we use that type of skill? So I've got 5 minutes of my part 3 or my standards check left. What skill do you need? Where can I go and recreate that skill? And then that makes it much better for me, and it's far more beneficial for the learner, in theory.
We'll find out. Is there any talk? I don't know whether you guys talk to the examiners any more than what everyone else does, but is there any thought on the part 3 standards check going back to, because it was an hour, wasn't it? Is there any thought on it going back, or are they looking to stick at what it is?
As far as I'm aware at the moment, from the conversations I've had with the DVSA, it's going to probably stay at that for the moment. The feedback that was given was it was changed obviously because of COVID, and they didn't want to spend too long in the car with people. And then what they recognised was a lot of the ADI examiners were coming back saying they found it more beneficial because previously, when it was an hour long, instructors used to spend the first 15 minutes sat there talking to their learners about, I've got dual controls, I can use them at any point, this is an examiner, and it was wasted anyway. So what examiners want to be able to see is your management of risk, because we're in a moving classroom, aren't we? And we can't really do that sat in a car park chatting for 15-20 minutes. You used a term earlier about wheels moving, but the DVSA don't say that. You know, they say that your learner should be able to drive for around 40 minutes. But the best explanation is, as long as you spend more time driving than sat by the side of the road, it still needs to be client-centered. So if my learner needs to pull over to reflect, that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, that's been my understanding of it. If you need to stop, you need to stop. It's your lesson for your student. That was the view I took on my second attempt. It's for my student. It's not for the examiner. It's what my student needs. If we need to pull over and stop, I'm going to pull over and have a chat about it. If we can keep going, we'll keep going. If we're showing progress, then we'll move on to a more challenging situation. But that was my thought. I don't know whether it's right or wrong. I assume so, that it's about the student, not the examiner, or you, as I thought on my first one. It's not about how much I know. It's about how I develop the student that sat there.
I do often, the advice I give to people is your part 3 or your standards check is a bit like a job interview. There's a certain amount of preparation we can do, but I don't know what's going to happen on the day. So I've got to be dynamic and I've got to be ready to do what I need to do on the day. I might show all my skills. I might not. I might only show some of my skills. I can do all the planning under the earth, but if something happens on the day, I've got to be ready for it, just like I would do with a job interview. Although I would like to add in, there's a reason I'm self-employed. So Perhaps I wasn't very good at job interviews, so maybe not take my advice on that.
And I've never really had to do one. So
There you go. Yeah,
either that or I do one every time I get a new student. You've got to sell yourself, haven't you? And
yeah,
if you don't do that, they won't come back.
yeah. And I do the same with trainees. And what I want to try and offer is value for money. I'm not the most expensive, and I'm definitely not the cheapest. But I try and offer value for money, and I think that is one of my selling points as a trainer, is that I'm often always on the end of the phone to answer questions. And I'm always happy to do that. I don't charge people for that. And that's just the way that I run my business, because those are the deficiencies I had with my training.
It's good. It's been great that you've come on tonight and shared so much as well. I've really enjoyed it. And
Yeah, I
hopefully
certainly enjoy myself.
anyone that's watching, well, hopefully they'll reach out to you. We'll put your information in the description so that people
Thank
can
you.
email you, do whatever you want to do. Any final points before we disappear? We could probably do on another thing, but we'll maybe we'll do another episode.
Keep it simple and think about the skills. And then what would be really interesting is to hear back from people, if we can, to whether that's a benefit to them and their learners, and see whether there was the improvement they've seen that I saw when I changed.
I'll put it out and I'll share it on the groups. We'll see. You can obviously do whatever you want with it as well and see if any of your guys find benefit. But yeah, I'd be interested in feedback. So if you've got any feedback, leave a comment. I'm no good at this stuff, but yeah, leave a comment and we'll get it eventually.
Fantastic.
But Tom, thank you very much for your time. It's been great talking to you. I hope you've enjoyed it, and hopefully some of your guys can get something out of this as well, and anyone else that's watching it. But thank you very much.
No, thank you again. Like I said to you before, I've sent some of my trainees some of your videos to watch through, and they found them really beneficial. So even if it helps just one person out there, I think you've got the right idea, and hopefully you're going to keep it going.
As long as people are willing to come and talk to me, I'll keep going. And if there's people watching, even better.
Yeah, in our industry, Josh, you're always going to have people who are going to want to come and talk to you. Trust me. So yeah, you'll be all right.
That's good. Well, maybe we'll get you on again when you've got a few other things that you want to get out there. You're welcome on any time. But
Brilliant.
thank you very
Fantastic.
much, Tom. Really
Thanks
enjoyed it.
again.